A New Home, Chapter 2. Less than a month after Annie's birthday, a postcard arrived at the Frank household. 16-year-old Margaret had received the dreaded summons from the Germans. The call up meant that she would be taken away to work in a German factory. Worse still, there was much talk in the Jewish community about the concentration camps, where the Germans were deporting a steadily increasing number of Jews. Since no one ever returned to report on these camps, people could only suspect with a dread that it would be like to live in one. Now that the Germans controlled the country, it was impossible for Jews to escape from Holland. Since Otto Frank knew that he and his family could not leave Holland, he thought of an alternate plan. Rather than risk having his family sent away by the Nazis, he would arrange for them to hide somewhere in Holland. Other Jews knew Other Jews he knew had already gone into hiding. It was called diving. Although the Germans controlled the country, many native Dutch people did not support them, did not agree with the anti-Semitism of the Germans, and felt great compassion for their Jewish neighbors. Some of these Dutch people helped the Jews by letting them hide in their basements, attics, or barns. Some Dutch families even took Jewish infants and young children into their homes and passed the children as of family members. Not only did these people share their ration food supplies with the Jews, they also put their own lives at risk. If the Germans were to discover that a Dutch family was sheltering Jews, then the family too would be arrested and sent to a concentration camp. Nevertheless, thousands of kind-hearted Dutch helped the Jews. Very early in the morning on July 6, 1942, Anne was awakened. Following her mother's instructions, Anne put on a layer of clothing. It was not a cold day, but it was the day the family was going into hiding, and it was too risky to be seen carrying suitcases. Anne wore two underskirts, three pairs of pants, a dress, a skirt, a jacket, a summer coat, two pairs of stockings, sturdy shoes, a woolen cap, and a scarf. She must have looked very fat with all that clothing on as she walked down the street with her parents at 7:30 a.m. Margaret had already left with Miep, a typist who worked for the spice firm that Otto Frank had run. Anne didn't know where Margaret and Miep were headed, and Anne didn't know where she was going as she walked with her parents out into the rain, each carrying a school satchel and a shopping bag filled with an odd assortment of possessions. She could not take her cat Morgie, but she knew that Morgie would be adopted by the neighbors without any problem. As they walked along, Anne's parents confided their plan to their daughter. Although they were diving suddenly because of the call up that Margaret had received, they had been planning for this moment for many months. They would be joined by three other Jews, Mr. and Mrs. Van Dan, and their 15-year-old son, Peter. Mr. Van Dan had worked in Otto Frank's spice business. Amazingly, their hiding place would not be out in the country, but in Amsterdam. And even more amazingly, it would be in the building where Otto Frank had once had his office. When the Germans occupied Holland, one of their regulations forbade Jews to control their own business. But even though Anne's father was no longer the director of his spice company, he was still closely associated with his former employees. And despite the propaganda against the Jews, these Christian employees remained loyal and devoted to their former boss. Anne and her parents walked all the way in the summer rain to the building at 263 Princeton Grange, the house that had been constructed in the 17th century alongside the canal. Because of the price of those early houses was determined by their width, Otto Frank's workplace was an extremely narrow building with steep steps leading to the upper floors. Behind the building facing the canal was a second building. It was connected to the first by an internal passageway. Anne had been here before, and she thought she knew the office and the warehouse, where spices and herbs were stored. But when she walked up the familiar steep staircase, she was surprised to discover that a small door led to several additional rooms in the back building. She could guess that behind the door were two more floors with a total of four rooms and an attic floor too. It was here that the Franks and the Van Dans were going to hide. This clever scheme to hide in Amsterdam under the very noses of the Nazis could not have been worked without the assistance of a few of Otto Frank's former employees. Two older men, Mr. Kraler and Mr. Corpus, and the two young women who worked in the office as typists, Miep Ann Satin and Ellie Boson. For many months, Otto Frank's loyal co-workers had been preparing for the arrival of their Jewish friends. The hidden rooms were filled with dishes, rugs, bedclothes, clothing, books, and furniture. There were boxes of canned food too. Each item had been brought into the building secretly. Not only did these devoted friends have to be sure that the Germans were unaware of what they were doing, but they had to take care that the other workers at the business did not know either. Mr. Kreller and Mr. Koffius felt that it was important to involve as few people as possible in this scheme. The Germans were offering reward money to those who helped them find hidden Jews. So everyone had to be very cautious if the Franks and the Van Dans were going to hide successfully until the enemy was defeated. The first days in hiding were busy because their move had taken place earlier than was originally planned. There was a great deal to be done by all of them. The boxes containing the Franks' possessions, which had been secretly sent ahead, were now waiting to be unpacked. Dark blackout curtains had to be made for all the windows so that no light would guide English and American planes flying overhead. But for the Franks, the curtains served another purpose. No one was to guess that these black rooms at 263 Prinsengracht were occupied. The workday ended at 5:30 p.m. People would become suspicious if they knew that the building was occupied after hours. The four rooms were divided up. Anne's parents had the larger room, just above the office. Next door was a small narrow room that Anne and Margaret were to share. At first, it looked bare and stark, not at all like their attractive rooms at home. But Otto Frank surprised Anne by showing her that he had packed her collection of picture postcards and magazine cutouts of movie stars. Using a pot of paste, Anne quickly covered the walls with her favorite pictures. Now, when she walked into her room, movie stars like Ginger Rogers, Diana Durbin, and Greta Garbo were smiling at her. She also pasted up a picture of the Dutch royal family. How good it was to know that they too were safe from the Nazis. There were many rules that Anne and her family had to follow if their hiding place was to remain secret. Although they had a bathroom and a kitchen with running water, during the day the water could not be used. That meant that the toilet could not be flushed, and pots of water had to be filled for use during the day. Many people came regularly to the lower floors at 263 Prinsengracht to conduct business. These people must not hear any strange noises overhead. Anne and the other had to tiptoe about in bedroom slippers, talking softly and even smothering their coughs. It was a relief when 5:30 came and it was safe to flush the toilet and to speak out loud once again. Yet, even at night, the heaters had to restrain themselves. It was quiet in the buildings all around them. and the Franks had to be careful in case their movements created suspicious echoes along the canal. But through the silence, one sound was constant. The Westorn clock sounded every quarter of an hour. Otto, Edith, and Margot Frank didn't like that chiming at all, but from the start, Anne loved it. When she lay in her narrow bed at night and it was too dark to see her beloved pictures, the chiming of the clock was like a friend to her. A week after the Frank family settled into life in the hidden rooms, they were joined by Mr. and Mrs. Van Daan and their son Peter. Mr. and Mrs. Van Daan occupied the room above that of Anne's parents. This room served as a kitchen and sitting room during the day. At night, beds were lowered from the walls for Mr. and Mrs. Van Daan to sleep in. Peter Van Daan slept in the small room adjoining his parents' room. Anne had looked forward to the arrival of the Van Daans. She thought it would be lots of fun when they were all together. In her diary, she wrote to Kitty that living in the secret rooms was like being on a vacation in a very peculiar boarding house. At first, it seemed like fun, two families cozily hidden together. They shared a dangerous secret, and together they felt safe in their secret annex. Mr. Van Daan reported on the rumors he had heard after the Franks had disappeared. Some of the neighbors said that the Frank family had managed to flee to Switzerland. Others insisted that they had seen the Franks depart on a pair of bicycles. Still another woman was certain that the entire family had been taken away in a car by the Nazis in the middle of the midnight. During the week that the Franks had been in hiding, more Jews than ever before had been arrested and sent away by the Nazis. No wonder the Franks were delighted to be together, safely out of sight of the Germans. The family would wait out the war together, and someday soon the Germans would be defeated and everyone could return home. In the meantime, Ellie Bolsen's father, who was also employed by the spice firm, was let in on a secret of the people in the annex. Mr. Boson was a clever carpenter. He devised a bookcase that was attached to the door leading to the rooms. It perfectly disguised the entrance to their hiding place. Now, certainly, no one could guess that anything was behind there. The two families ate their meals together, everyone helping in its preparation and in the cleaning up afterward. It was nice to have another young person around. Even though Peter Van Daan, like Margot Frank, was quiet and didn't speak much. He had brought his cat, Muskie, to the annex, which proved very useful. Rats had gotten into the store bags of food in the attic, but Muskie soon took care of the rodents. After a while, however, this cozy safety of the annex was not enough. The hiders could not go outside for fresh air or a walk. They had to look at the same walls and the same faces over and over. Their only trips were to the offices below their rooms. They could go there at night after the staff had departed for the day. Lack of variety in their days made life tiresome and boring. Otto Frank planned a full schedule of studies for the three young people. When the war was over, he did not want them to be behind in their schoolwork. Besides, studying French verbs and doing arithmetic helped pass the time. Ellie from the office below sent for a correspondence course so the young people could study shorthand. It would be a useful skill for Anne and Margot to have in the future. Still, the sameness of the day routine remained boring. Everyone grew tense and easily irritated. Sharp words were often exchanged, and Chatterbox Anne discovered that she was more often than not the cause of arguments. Mrs. Van Daan criticized if Anne did not want to eat a large portion of the detested vegetable, Also, when Anne tried to joke and make comments to relieve the unpleasant mood at mealtime, Mrs. Van Daan was not amused. It's absurd that Anne so frightfully spoils, Mrs. Van Daan said frequently. I wouldn't put up with it if Anne were my daughter. Anne was thankful that she was not Mrs. Van Daan's daughter, but her own mother and sister often found fault with her behavior, too. She discovered that it was not easy to be 13 while being locked away in a hidden place with others who seemed old and serious and unsympathetic so much of the time. Luckily, Anne had her diary. Even if no one else could understand how she felt and why she acted the way she did, at least Kitty never scolded her. So, day after day, when her studies were completed and her chores were done, Anne would find herself a private corner and would tell Kitty what had been occurring in the secret annex. In November 1942, after the Franks and the Van Daans had been in hiding for 4 months, it was decided that there was not enough room and food in the annex to hide one more person. Mr. Corpus and Mr. Crowler both agreed that it was just as dangerous for 7 as for 8 to be hidden in the building. A conference was held and several Jewish friends were considered. It was not easy to select just one individual. Finally, Miep carried a message to Albert Dussel, a dentist whom both families knew. Dussel arrived and moved his possessions into Anne's small room. He would share it with Anne and Margaret would sleep with her parents, while the 8 occupants of the secret annex sat around the table drinking coffee. Dussel told them all that had been happening in Amsterdam during the months they were in hiding. It was news that Miep and their older guardians had avoided speaking of, so as not to distress their Jewish friends. Dussel said that night after night, the Germans police, the Gestapo, had driven about the city ringing bells, doorbells, and inquiring if there were Jews present. When the Jews were discovered, they were put into trucks and taken off to Westburg, a big prison camp that had been set up in Holland. There, they had their heads shaved and were forced to live under extremely primitive conditions. When she heard the stories from Dussel, Anne realized that despite the hardships of being confined in such a small hideaway, she was living in a paradise compared to those Jews who had not managed to hide from the Nazis. Anne sat down and wrote in her diary. She knew she was very lucky.